For instance, if we're only going to salute the flag when we agree with everything our country has done, I'm sorry, that's just childish. It's myopic.
Welcome to Matters of Soul Importance, where we dive deeply into topics of both earthly and eternal consequence. I'm Roxanne Solonen, faith columnist and features writer for the Forum, author, and speaker. In this episode, I ask Mark Jorritsma, is patriotism dead? We've just passed the July 4th, 2024, and it seems an appropriate topic to discuss today. Mark has been serving as the executive director of the North Dakota Family Alliance since 2016. Prior to his role there, he worked for 12 years at World Vision US as COO, working with budgeting and coordinating strategic planning for resource distribution to over 60 countries. His family includes his wife, Ruth, son, Christopher, and daughter, Stephanie. Oh, and their goofy but lovable rescue dog, Annie. Through the North Dakota Family Alliance, Mark represents thousands of Christians across North Dakota in the policy arena. I have appreciated the newsletters the nonprofit puts out regularly, and when I decided it was time to discuss the question of the day, is patriotism dead, Mark came to mind, mainly because of his organization's strong commitment to traditional values. And now, even having said that, I wince a bit because I don't believe patriotism should be something from the past, and the word traditional tends to imply that which is passé. I don't think that's true, but it's for discussion today. Is patriotism important? And if so, how strong is our nation's identity and unity? What happens when we cease to pledge allegiance to the flag? Is our growing propensity to dishonor our stars and stripes a red flag for democracy's survival? So many questions come from that first one, and Mark will help us unpack it all today. So with that, let's unfurl the flag and see what might unfold. Well, thanks so much, Mark, for being willing to discuss a topic that some don't believe should be controversial, and yet it has become that day in our age, patriotism. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I certainly would. And first of all, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It is controversial. Sadly, it has become that way. And I guess the way I look at it is there's healthy patriotism and there's unhealthy patriotism. Now, It isn't black and white. It's a continuum, like most things in life, right? But healthy patriotism is, and this, I guess, denotes how old I am, but it's more like the patriotism we had in maybe the 1950s, 1960s, something like that. And the thing to keep in mind is that family is the building block, which is why we're North Dakota Family Alliance. So the family and how healthy it is, in turn, dictates how healthy our communities are, which dictates how healthy our society is and how healthy our government is. So it all goes back. It all goes back to the family. If you think of the positive version, the healthy version of patriotism, I would say that it's still alive and well. It's not necessarily on the rise too much. I wouldn't characterize it that way. The things that strike me are that healthy patriotism has its roots in biblical patriotism, not a theocracy, right? But it's the kind of thing where we pray for our leaders, yes, including President Biden and those we may not agree with. We pray for our state legislators. Christ said to render to Caesar what is Caesar's. He clearly saw there being a role for government, for civil government. And there's nothing wrong with having some level of allegiance to civil government. Our first and foremost allegiance is to Christ, but that doesn't mean it's exclusive. You have unhealthy patriotism. Now, that has, at least from what I've seen, it's cropped up pretty significantly in just the last few years. And the way I think of that is it's a sense of losing perspective on history and politics becomes all-consuming. It consumes the person's entire life, and we are going to save our nation.
Mm-hmm.
We are there, and we are the only solution. And it ends up leading to an imbalance. And anytime you misprioritize things in your life, you have an imbalance, and it's not good. It comes back to bite you. As a result, you end up with people insulting those on the other side of issues, not valuing their opinions. There's no civil discourse like there used to be. We recently had a gala, and one of the things I said there was, North Dakota Family Alliance, we're not Republicans. We're not Democrats. We're not Lutherans, Catholics, evangelicals. We are based on biblical values. And I think if more of us perhaps looked at it that way, instead of the R's versus the D's, or the conservative R's versus the less conservative D's, or excuse me, R's, then things might take a different tone, be less adversarial. You know, one of the things that you hear discussed is there may come a point where we as conservatives or as Christians, choose your word, we may need to take up arms, I guess that's the way that you hear it said quite often. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, what is that tipping point? And is it because it's things that are in opposition to the Constitution, which is significant because it's the basis for our form of government? Or is it something that asks you to do a thing that's in opposition to biblical values? And how do those two things balance each other out? And how is our action in response to that related to what kind of tipping point it is?
Yeah, you set that up very nicely. You gave us a good framework for how to look at this, because I think it can get really confusing. And so before we go on and jump into a little bit more of that, I want to just kind of ask you how it was that you got to North Dakota Family Alliance, and then just what do you do exactly, so we can kind of get a sense for where you're coming from.
You bet. The short answer of how I got to North Dakota Family Alliance was definitely God leading us here. When I first applied for this job, it was actually on a bit of a lark. I saw it. I thought, well, it looks kind of interesting. Never done public policy before in my life. But I thought, well, that could be kind of interesting. And so I applied on a lark, and I got a call back. And they said, we'd like to interview you. It's like, really? Okay. And so I interviewed via Zoom, and it all went well. I thought, okay, well, that's it. So they call me the next week. We'd like to interview you again. I'm thinking to myself, okay, now I need to think about this. Right. Because if these people want to interview me, someone who's never done this before, a second time, I'm not really sure I want to work for them because they may not have the best judgment, and there may be a problem here. Well, long story short, I ended up coming to work for them, and it was interesting because the CEO at the time, Paul Weber, he was out in Maryland where we lived, out in DC, and he said, I'd like to get together with you and your wife and have dinner. I said, well, that's great. And I thought it was interesting, by the way, that he wanted Ruth to come along, which tells you something about the organization, too. This was Family Policy Alliance at the time.
Right.
And so we're almost done with the phone call. He says, okay, well, I'll see you at Olive Garden. He said, I do have one question, however. It's like, oh, boy. He said, why do you want to move to North Dakota? And I said, well, I'll be honest with you, Paul. I've never actually sat down and said, gosh, I'd really love to move to North Dakota. It is part of my dream. However, what I have learned over the years is that you go where God leads you. And there's two ways you can react to that. One way is you can continue to follow your own plan. And I guarantee you, God will find a metaphorical 2x4 and whack you upside the head until you follow his plan. Or you can do it the painless way and follow his plan in the first place. So those are kind of your choices. And being the stubborn Dutchman I am, I had to get whacked upside the head a few times, but I learned that you go where God calls you. So We ended up in North Dakota, in Bismarck here, and I was doing public policy. At that time, we were part of Family Policy Alliance, a national organization. But in the last 3 years, we've gone independent again, like we were before, and we call ourselves now North Dakota Family Alliance, is what we were called. We've been around for 37 years.
Okay.
And what we do is our mission is to equip North Dakotans to engage in God-honoring citizenship and advocate for policies that strengthen faith, family, and freedom. And we do that primarily through the legislature. That's what a lot of people know us for. We help write bills, we get them through, we alert them to call their senator and representatives and so on. But we also do other things like education and partnering with churches and business leaders and so on.
It's so interesting because we are doing this recording on Election Day in North Dakota, June 11th, and we'll be dropping the episode a day after the 4th of July. So there's a lot of connecting forces here for this conversation.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. So coming back then to the definition of patriotism, here's what Wikipedia gave me. It said, the feeling of love, devotion, and a sense of attachment to a country or state, which can constitute different feelings for such things as the language of one's homeland and its ethnic, cultural, political, or historical aspects. So I guess I'd just like to hear what you think about that definition, and maybe you have something a little bit different from that. What is it? What is patriotism to you?
Well, I think, like so many of us, patriotism, if you have to define it, becomes very personal. And for me, it's about my parents. My parents in 1950 immigrated from the Netherlands to the United States. They had just gotten married, and literally weeks later, they immigrated, which at that time was an even bigger deal because you couldn't simply fly across the Atlantic and go back and visit. And they landed in Hoboken, New Jersey. They went to Michigan. They had a sponsoring family, which is the way they did it back then. And for them, America was a place of hope. America was a place where there was freedom and anything was possible, a land of opportunity. And the level of patriotism they had, and in turn conveyed to me and instilled in me, was huge. And I saw that also as other members of our family came to America. My grandfather came to America, and my uncles and so on. And they had the same thing. They were some of the most patriotic people I know, and I think in large part because they did not take for granted the freedoms and the other things that we have here as Americans. And one of the things that strikes me, one of the hallmarks, I guess, of that generation or those people who immigrated was the sense of giving or sacrifice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They left their families, and pretty much permanently in many senses. And in the case of my parents, my father was actually an architectural engineer and a very smart fellow and very, very good at what he did. He came to America and he worked in a hardware store selling hardware. And he never complained. That, I don't know, to me, that level of sacrifice is significant. And it's something that he did because of what this country meant to him and because he was patriotic, in a word. So again, for me, patriotism is a very personal thing, as it may be for you or other folks.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think of my dad, and he's no longer alive. I wish he was, because I would like to ask him a little bit more about what those tears were. But whenever there was a patriotic song, he would have tears in his eyes. He was in the Air Force. All of his, he and his brothers were all in the service, and they're buried in the Veterans Memorial Cemetery in Mandan, North Dakota, which, they always decorate with the American flag. It's a very obviously patriotic place. I feel like it's the perfect place for my dad's resting place. But he would always tear up. And I know that his oldest brother was over in Hawaii, I believe, in on the Navy, I think, when Pearl Harbor broke out. And he told some stories about everyone gathered around the radio, listening to hear, and he was the youngest son in a family of 9 kids. But I think there was some deep emotion there. And again, I wish I knew more. I wish I would have had time to think about it and ask him about it. But he would always have the American flag out in our front yard on special days or even most of the year. And so we try to do that same thing. But I feel like I'm kind of borrowing my sense of patriotism from him because, yeah, I feel like the further we're removed from that sacrifice, the more we have lost sight maybe of what that means. I don't have the same deep emotional connection as my dad did, but I feel like it's important, and I want to honor my dad, whatever those tears were for. I respect my dad, and I know that he didn't just cry at the drop of a hat like that, but that was one of the times I saw him with tears in his eyes. And I just feel like, okay, a couple years ago, we got a flag and we're doing the same thing now. I think of him and, but again, I know that I don't have the connection. I remember doing the Pledge of Allegiance, when we were growing up, and that seems to kind of have dissipated a bit. But what is the importance of not losing our grasp on it? And tell me a little bit about what you've seen in the time that you've been in your position since 2016, and how some of that has changed and maybe is even threatened.
Yeah. Wow. That's a big question. That's okay. It's a big topic. I think, let me get very specific to my circumstance, and let me pull back a little bit more generally. In this particular role, doing public policy or political work, what was interesting is in 2017, my very first session, I remember it was probably just days into the session, I was approached by a legislator who I didn't know. And he introduced himself and I introduced myself. And he kind of looked at me, he said, why don't you just go away? We don't need you here. And it may surprise some of the folks who are listening, but that was a Republican. And again, it goes back to what I was saying. We don't have an R or D or anything else behind our name, North Dakota Family Alliance. We're about families and we're about biblical values. And apparently he disagreed with that, or he thought we were an arm of the Democratic Party, which seems like a stretch, but he didn't want us there. And one of the things, and this will come as no surprise, I think, to you or any of your listeners, is that there's certainly more division. When you were talking about our parents, and particularly, you think of war times and things like that, what values do you think of? You think of unity and sacrifice, right?
Yeah.
And now think about today, unity and sacrifice. It's about me, and it's about this polarization, this radicalization that's happening, and it's about what I stand for and not coming together. It's not problem solving, it's reacting. The lack of civil discourse, I see it in the legislature. It's often not the case, thankfully more often than not it is, but it's often not the case where legislators can come together and talk about an issue in a civil manner, have civil discourse, and then walk away with more knowledge and understanding, go back, think about it, and so on. That is the exception as opposed to the rule. And I'm not even talking about Democrats versus Republicans. I'm talking about within the Republican Party. And the Republican Party, don't get me wrong, is fabulous for what it stands for. Its platform, as you might imagine, is almost synonymous with what we stand for. So I absolutely love that. And so that's great. But there is a level of division, not just nationally, but here in North Dakota that exists in the party, and it just really cripples us in so many different ways. There's. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I'm trying to figure out why. I'm just, my immediate thought is, are the legislators feeling beholden to the people who are divided? I'm just trying to figure out if, where that stems from. Is it trying to, respond to a divided world, or, I don't know. We're probably not going to get to the exact root of it. We just know that something has changed. Like, the flag itself is, and I know there's been different times through history where it's been controversial, but it is a symbol of division. It seems like, it's either good or bad, So how do we? Any ideas on, especially in your role? Have you thought of any solutions to that? How are you trying to? Because, like you said, you're not one or the other party. So you're a unifying organization. Have you addressed that at all? Or is that something that's still kind of floating around out there as far as how to, or maybe that's not part of your function? I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
I would say that it is part of our function, but in certain ways, in ways that we can be effective in doing that. For instance, we do quite a few different conferences, and we do a pro-life conference, a conference on the family, a prayer conference, and so on. And they're certainly within our wheelhouse as an organization, but one of the big things about each of them is the educational component. So if you walk into one of these conferences and you have a certain perspective on the family, and you hear someone from another perspective, you will probably sit there and you will listen to them. You're not going to start arguing with them like you might otherwise and cutting each other off and so on, but you're going to sit there and you're going to listen, and hopefully there's going to be some understanding, and you internalize a little bit of that and say, okay, maybe some of this isn't quite as bad. And so that's one of the things we try and do. The other thing that I've been very big on since the day I walked into North Dakota is collaboration and unity. When I got here in 2017, there are a number of organizations like us that work in North Dakota and stand for our type of values or some subset of it. You have Concerned Women for America, Linda Thorson. You have North Dakota Right to Life. You have the Catholic Conference, which does phenomenal work in the legislature. And we worked together, sort of, kind of. And it so happened that God sort of made us work together. It all came together, but there certainly wasn't always a lot of planning. And so what we've done for instance, like before the last session, before 2023, is we actually got all of the nonprofits together. And we hosted a half day where we sat and talked about what the key issues were for the coming legislative session, how we were going to deal with them, who was going to take lead on the issues, and come up with that unity that we are all striving for. And then we connected all of that with the legislators. We did the same thing with legislators and brought them in, key legislators, and we said, okay, we, the nonprofits, this is how we look at the world. How can we support you? And so that whole process, it just kind of reflects NDFA's perspective and my perspective on this. And I love a quote. There's a quote by Thomas Paine. He says, "Not in numbers, but in unity, that our great strength lies."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it sounds like you're very much about fostering communication and kind of being that voice that tries to sit down at the table. And that's so important in this world right now, because there's just so much going on with social media and different things that are dividing us. It's hard to bring it all together, but it sounds like you're doing the best you can with that. I want to throw something at you that I didn't prepare you for, but just because this is matters of soul importance, I want to hear a little bit about your faith background and how you came to value family and the things that you're talking about, like you personally.
Sure. I was raised in an absolutely wonderful home. I could not have asked for a better home. As I said before, parents were immigrants. They were of the Reformed faith, Reformed denomination. And my father started working in that hardware store, later got an engineering job, and then the Lord called him into the ministry. And he, not unlike me, went biting, kicking, scratching. So apparently it's a Jorritsma thing. But anyway, he eventually went into the ministry and was in the ministry for 35 years. So I was a preacher's kid, and that comes with pros and cons and everything. But it was definitely an environment where you lived out your faith, and that was what you did. And your purpose, if you're a Calvinist like we were, your purpose on earth is to glorify God. That is why we are here. And that goes into all facets of life. There's no facet of life which is exempt from God's rule and us working towards making that closer to his wishes and the kingdom of God. And so as a result, years ago, politics was a dirty word to me. I'll be honest. It was not good. The only worse word was lobbyist. So if you ever doubt that God doesn't have a sense of humor, just look at me, Mark the lobbyist, doing politics. But the home I was raised in, essentially, I learned that there was no area of life that was off limits when you were a Christian. There are some, notable exceptions, but by and large. And so, to get to your question, I was raised in that environment. I accepted the Lord in fourth grade, age 9, as my Savior, and made public profession of faith. We believed in infant baptism, so I'd already been baptized, and then went to a Christian college, Calvin University out in Michigan, where my faith was further strengthened, and I met the love of my life. So it's a nice benefit on top of it. And she also is a wonderful Christian lady and has helped me grow in my faith over the years. So that's kind of how it started. I never anticipated that I would be doing this at this point in my life. Never in a million years. I'm an economist by training. My goal, actually getting out of grad school, was, to accumulate wealth. That was, my roommate always used to joke that I'm like Michael J. Fox in Family Ties. My goal is to be a business tycoon and just get as much wealth as possible. That's who I was. And, I look back now and I'm not proud of that. That's for sure. But that has changed over the years. God has moved me in the right direction in easy ways, in hard ways. And I'd like to think that I've matured over the years and come to understand that that is a very vapid sort of existence.
We talked to Senator Yana Myrdal not too long ago, and she said if you're planning on politics as your goal in life, if you start out and you want to go to college for that, that's probably the wrong thing to do. So it sounds like you came about it the right way in terms of that wasn't something you were going to do, and it sounds like your faith and family moved you in that direction. Like you realized that's where my heart kind of opens up a little bit to politics too, even though it's not my thing. But at the same time, it is important that we speak out and take part in the process that creates laws. We need laws. It's not a disordered world, and Christians deserve to have that voice as much as anyone else. So, I think this is a good time to pause. And then I want to come back on the other side of the break and talk a little bit more about how you set things up in terms of the bad patriotism and the good. I can't remember how you said it. Bad and
healthy
good.
and unhealthy. Yeah.
That's better. Yeah. Healthy and unhealthy patriotism. So we will return here with more Matters of Soul Importance with Mark Jorritsma after this break. So stay with us.
Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month. You'll get unlimited access to the news you need to stay engaged and connected to your community. Visit inforum.com/subscribe now to get 3 months of local news for only 99 cents a month.
Welcome back to Matters of Soul Importance. This is Roxanne Solonen, your host, and we have Mark Jorritsma from the North Dakota Family Alliance. Is that the right name? Yes. The North Dakota Family Alliance. You threw that other name in there, and I'm like, oh.
It is. And the joke we have here is it's kind of like a set of dice. On the dice are the words family, policy, North Dakota, alliance, and you just roll them, and you take each one in turn, and that's the name of your organization. It isn't,
Okay.
obviously, but it seems that way sometimes.
Sure. Well, I wanted to bring up the topic of Christian nationalism because it's something I've been hearing about, and I'm kind of confused about what it actually means. It seems to be a bad. There you go with the bad. It seems to be a negative description of some people right now in the political realm, or just the people and what they're fighting for. And I think the idea is that. A lot of Christian people maybe are wanting a theocracy, wanting this to be a Christian nation, wanting to coerce everyone to be Christian or to follow the precepts of Christianity. That's the sense I'm getting. I could be wrong about that. It's still something new to me. So I'm sure you've run into it a little bit. Why don't you explain a little bit what you're seeing that it seems to be meaning to people?
Absolutely. There was an article, I think, from Christianity Today, and it had kind of some interesting wording in there. And I got it here. Christian nationalists do not reject the First Amendment and do not advocate for theocracy. Okay. But they do believe Christianity should enjoy a privileged position in the public square. They say the term Christian nationalism is relatively new, and its advocates generally do not use it of themselves, but it accurately describes American nationalists who believe American identity is inextricable from Christianity.
Okay.
It's an interesting way of looking at it, and the part that gets me is actually the latter part. American identity is inextricable from Christianity. But I would say Christian identity has nothing to do with being American. Mm-hmm. There are Christians all around the world. And
right.
Just because you're American doesn't mean you need to be Christian. But you cannot deny, well, you can deny, but you'd be wrong, that this nation was founded upon Christian principles, or at a minimum, deistic principles. And so I think they have the order kind of wrong when they say that.
Yeah. I guess I feel like Christians have been kind of there's a faction, there's a force that wants to push us out of the public square, and that's where my concern is. But I'm with you that I don't want to force people to be Christian, but at the same time, I can't help. But like you said, that's something you learned early on, that our Christian belief, our belief in God and our principles of God creating this world, and that it's an ordered world that is set up a certain way for us to have the most fulfillment and success as far as, what our ultimate goal is, which is to get to heaven, and that there's a certain order for that. And we can't just separate ourselves out and be people that only profess and live out our faith in church or in our private sector. There has to be a way for us to have a voice in the public square. So I feel like there's some kind of balance here between how it should be, how it's meant to be, and this Christian nationalism, at least how people are understanding it. So it seems like you're kind of parsing that out in the way that I would too, but how do we help people understand that when we're wanting to be part of the public square and have a voice, that is not pushing Christianity on people? How do you make that distinction?
It's difficult because in today's culture, that's the first thing they're going to go to. Certainly those on the other side of the issues from where we are. And, this gets back to patriotism and over the years, if you think back what I was talking about in the 1950s, And by the way, I do not want to go back and live in the 1950s, although I've mentioned it a couple times now. But back in the 40s, 50s, and so on, you had issues, clearly. You had issues about women's rights and racism, environmental issues, and so on. And it was far from perfect, but there was patriotism. Now, we still have problems, but they're different problems. But the problems are radicalization of academia, the countercultural 1970s movement, social relativism. And so now, today, our problems are actually undermining patriotism. They're not standing alongside of it, where patriotism is still a good thing and it kind of actually balances things a little bit. But now they actually undermine who we are as patriots, if you will. However, okay, there's some good news in this. There's a Gallup poll maybe a couple months ago, I think, and they asked if people were proud of their country. And they broke it out into extremely proud and very proud and moderately proud and only a little and not at all. The interesting finding was that in the categories of proud in general, moderately, very, and extremely, 87% found themselves in there. So if 87% of those polled by Gallup said we are proud of our country at some level, it tells me patriotism is still there. So it's not dead. And the other 13%, it's sad, they're so disenfranchised, but okay, they're not proud. But it does give me some hope that there is patriotism there, despite the fact that we have these rifts, that we have these chasms when it comes to our philosophies.
Mm-hmm. So there's a love of country,
Yeah.
but there's a divide in our philosophies, and there's different cultures coming together, and it gets a little bit mixed up in there. You know, I'm gonna throw something in here that I have been thinking about as we've been talking. I grew up on the Fort Peck Reservation in Poplar, Montana, where my parents were teachers, and so I was a white girl. I was a Washichu on the reservation, but you know, I know, you know, when we were thinking of how our country was founded, and then I'm thinking, well, you know, that was, you know, later. There was another founding, you know, peoples and earlier. You know, I always have that in mind, but growing up, a lot of American Indians is what I'll call them, and that's what they call themselves, or Native Americans. They were very patriotic. A lot of them fought for our country, and so it felt. I felt like, you know, when my dad was unfurling the flag, that was all, you know, a uniting thing. I got the sense that, yes, there had been turmoil in our past, and we're still dealing with some of the implications of that. But at the same time, those American Indians who fought and are still fighting for us were very proud of that, and were honored by the flag. And that was a strong sentiment that I grew up with. I didn't see that division there. So I don't know. It's just something that came to mind as we're talking. And I guess I wish we could have a more of a healthy approach to it, as you were saying in the beginning, healthy and unhealthy. What are some of the dangers in going the unhealthy route? Like, how do we veer away from that and come back to more of a positive approach to patriotism?
Well, the obvious poster child for the bad version, the unhealthy version, is Nazi Germany. If you want to come up with one, there was a lot of patriotism in Nazi Germany. I mean, that waned over the course of the war, but it was certainly there. But it was, I think anyone would say, very, very unhealthy. And so again, you need a point of truth. You need a touchstone. So, in other words, if things are happening in a certain direction and they seem to be patriotic, and you're thinking, okay, this is good, this is consistent with who we need to be as a country, what's the touchstone to say, yes, that's right, or no, it isn't? For us, that's biblical values. Because patriotism, the definition of patriotism, it will change over time. I mean, that's what we're talking about today.
Mm-hmm,
It will change
mm-hmm.
over time. Biblical values, no. And
Right.
so you have something that's not moving, and that helps you define and interpret this other thing that is moving and changing. And it tells you when it's on the right path and when it's on the wrong path. And mentioning Native Americans is interesting because in some sense you could, I think they looked at things maybe the same way that my parents did, or other immigrants and what have you. Sadly, that was kind of the case. But I think perhaps they looked at it the same way, and they were brought into the nation to a certain extent. But the thing was, in both those cases, they were grateful for a country, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And they didn't have to agree with everything. And I think that's
Right.
part of today's problem too. And for instance, if we're only going to salute the flag when we agree with everything our country has done, I'm sorry, that's just childish. It's
Mm-hmm.
myopic. It's like saying you absolutely will not respect your parents if they do one thing. They don't allow you to go to dances, or they don't allow you to smoke when you're 16 or whatever it is. And therefore, my parents are completely wrong. I have no respect for them at all.
And we're seeing that. I was
Yes.
thinking that earlier, that it kind of goes along this decline of patriotism, even though you say, yes, it's still there and there's hope. But what we've seen of the decline almost seems to kind of go along with the cancel culture.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, I'll bring something else in too. I do not like the abortion laws that a lot of our country has.
Right.
I haven't been happy with that. That doesn't mean I'm not proud of our country, and believe that we have instilled a lot of creativism, and that there's a freedom here, has been. Yes, it's always threatened, but that, I'm glad that I live here. I've been afforded opportunities, and I guess this is all I know. So, but I don't know. Any thoughts on there?
Yeah. Well, I came across an interesting statistic the other day. Again, we have our issues here, like you're saying, but how bad is it? And not just internally, how bad is it relative to the rest of the world? And what's interesting is that we are number one in the world, and have been for decades, in terms of immigration. The number of immigrants coming into our country far outweighs immigration to any other country in the world. Yet, our population represents 4.2% of the world population. We're a sanctuary. We are, going back to what I was saying, a place of hope. We're a place of freedom. And that's how people look at us from the outside, or at least they have for many years. I think that has unfortunately dwindled with the most recent administration. But overall, I still think we're seen as that. For decades, we were the police of the world, if you will, when conflicts arose. Whether or not you agree with that is irrespective. But the fact is, we were seen that way, and we were expected to operate that way because we were seen as being just. We were seen as being fair, and having the ideals that were associated with America. And it's easy, I think, as Americans, we take it for granted, but we look at the bad, right? We spend so much time looking at the bad things. Like you're saying, if my entire life revolved around the pro-life issue, and whether abortion is legal or not legal in the United States, I would have a dismal existence. I'm just saying. Is that important? Absolutely, particularly given what we do here at North Dakota Family Alliance. It's incredibly important. But that can't shape 100% of my view on whether or not I need to be patriotic towards my country. And it makes us lose perspective. Again, anytime that you misprioritize or focus too much on something, you end up with an imbalance in your life, and something is going to suffer. And in this case, patriotism.
Right. Well, how about this then? Since this is matters of soul importance, what do you think Jesus thinks about patriotism, like based on his teachings? Let's get back to the Christian foundation here. What would he say if you asked him about patriotism?
Well, unlike some might say, he wouldn't wear stars and stripes on his arm of his cloak. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be disrespectful here, but I mean, some people would actually say that it's pretty close to that. And that's clearly not the case. But he did say that you need to submit to the laws of your country. You need to pray for your leaders. And of course, the sentence that we're very familiar with, render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and to God what belongs to God. And the thing to keep in mind there is the ruler at that time, when he was saying that, was Tiberius Julius Caesar Augustus. He was really a bad guy. And so he's basically saying, render to him what belongs to him. So you need to be, in some sense, not maybe in submission, but you need to recognize that he is the leader, no matter how bad he is. And he was way worse than the leaders we've had here. So you need to live in your world and participate in government. Your highest allegiance clearly needs to be to God, but not exclusive. And what's interesting is Christian theologians always stressed that violence against your country, to go back to what we were saying, was always the last resort. Christians were very anti-war until about 600 AD. And protecting other people was the highest good. So there's a difference between working against your government and overthrowing it. And I think God calls us to do the best we can where we are. And if you feel you need to overthrow a government, is it for a moral reason or contractual reason? Are they not doing what they're supposed to do, or is it because they're inherently evil and rebelling against God's will? And those are very, very different reasons.
Yes.
And I'm not saying one is necessarily right and one is wrong, but we just need to be able to differentiate, because yes, they need to respect the Constitution. And I think it was Thomas Jefferson said, when a government no longer follows the Constitution, it's time for it to go, essentially. And I'm not disagreeing with that, but the greater issue, I think, is if the government is inherently evil, like we had talked about with the Nazis and things like that. There, it's on a very different scale. And I think that steps outside of what Jesus was teaching when he said, render to Caesar what is Caesar's.
Right. And one more point on that before we kind of start wrapping it up. But one danger that I see is I do see some people kind of equating politics with, like, they've made their politics their religion. Is that fair to say?
Oh, yeah.
And they're actually looking to politics. And I think you kind of said that earlier too, but that's where I see one danger is expecting the political sphere to solve the issue that only God himself can do. And relying on that and almost, again, making it your religion. Like some people, that's their God. And that's scary to me too. So again, I think that's more of the unhealthy patriotism, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are so many ways to influence our world and to influence this country. A very effective way, I would say, is through public policy, through the political world, clearly. And so if you want to express your Christian viewpoint, if you want that to be remembered that it's the foundation of our country, that's certainly a way to do it. There are many other ways to do that as well. So it's a little bit of if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail syndrome. And it loses, again, perspective, I think, on the different ways we as Christians can shape culture. And this is me saying this, and I do this for a living. And I recognize, however, that I'm one piece of the puzzle. You can contribute to a crisis pregnancy center. You can go down to a soup kitchen. You can contribute to us, and we will help advance Christian policies in the legislature. They're all working towards Christ's kingdom in different ways. And one is not all the way at the top and the rest are way below it. That's not how it works. I would never claim that.
Right. Another thought too is just, I believe, and I think you do too, that the Christian faith is lived out to its fullest, a benefit to everyone. Mm-hmm. It lived out in its purest form. It reaches everyone and loves everyone and wants everyone to live an abundant life. Yeah. So we do have that. I guess it's just a matter of how that plays out and how we move into that sphere, that public sphere to let that radiate. So kind of that, but then I want to let you have the final, and that's circling back to our original question, is patriotism dead? You've kind of addressed that as well. So if it's still limping along, that you've said, how can we revive it? And should we even try?
I would say healthy patriotism is alive. Unfortunately, it's more and more taking a backseat to the unhealthy patriotism or lack of patriotism that I was talking about. And it's a direction we're going, which is wrong in my estimation. Patriotism is built on hope and a vision. Where can we as a country go? What is that destination where we truly exercise our faith and our citizenship and so on? What does that look like? And it's a focus on us, not on me. We've become such an individualistic country, and there are good things that go along with that. But again, if you think back, it's one of the changes that has occurred in the last maybe 4 or 5 decades. We've become so individualistic. And so it undermines, I think, a lot of the us, the fact that it needs to be us and not me. The whole thought of sacrificing for the common good is not as common today. I think you would agree. Mm-hmm. The individualism in America is very hard to come back from if you can at all. And again, there's some things that are good about that. But I think within a political spectrum, there are some definite negatives. I heard a quote not too long ago, and it said, the difference between a real soldier and you would be that you might die to protect yourself, but a soldier will die to protect someone else. And that to me, yeah. Sacrifice. That you come back. We're coming back to the Christian principles again, and Jesus on the cross. What did he show us? What was his final act? It was to show us love through sacrifice. Yes. And if you want to go back to our politicians, you go to JFK. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. That is the mindset. I think it is the biblical imperative of how we look at patriotism. Will patriotism drive us to a point where maybe we say, okay, our government needs to be rehashed, it's just not working? It's possible. It's always possible. Our founding fathers knew that. But before we get to that point, have we tried everything else to unite us? And that includes sacrifice and not being selfish on our part.
Yeah, as you're talking there, I was thinking about this. I think a life lived in sacrifice is what brings us out of despair. So if we could just focus on that, the despair that we've fallen into, I think there is a hopelessness that has pervaded our land. And if we could begin again to love others for the sake of love and not just for our own gain, perhaps we will come back to that healthy patriotism that Christ wants and that our country was ideally founded on. So, Mark, anything else before we go today? I just have appreciated this conversation so much. And is there any lingering thoughts that you have before we say goodbye?
Well, I have lots of thoughts, but as far as patriotism is concerned, those are kind of the major things that have come to me. And I want to thank you again for inviting me on your show. It's certainly an honor, and just as long as your listeners know, North Dakota Family Alliance, we're out here. And we're fighting for biblical values, and we're doing it in the legislature every day. And whether you understand it or not, whether you recognize it or not, we're there. Like I always say, we're the sheepdog in the halls of Bismarck, and we will continue to do that.
And how can people get connected with you and just kind of keep up with you through your newsletter, things like that?
The primary way that we communicate with folks is electronically, and it's through our emails and through Facebook and other social media. And I realize that poses a bit of a challenge, perhaps not for our generation, but for older generations, because they don't tend to use social media and even email as much as we do. But it is the fastest, most effective way, particularly during session, where you have a bill that may be voted on in 8-10 hours. You can't send out mail. It just simply doesn't work, right? So the way to get connected with us is to sign up for our emails. And the best way to do that is to simply go to our website. And our website is ND, like North Dakota, ndfamilyalliance.org. And you scroll down the bottom of the very first page, the landing page, and you can sign up for our emails. I would also encourage folks to take a look at our statement of faith and our values. Our values touch on what we believe concerning marriage, religious freedom, a life, all these major areas, some of which we've been talking about today. And take a look at it. See if you agree with it. And let us know. We're always interested in how people view things, particularly Christians, and are we in sync with what they believe, and are we in sync with the Bible? So, ndfamilyalliance.org. I think it's a good site. Check it out.
I love that family's in there. I think there's probably no one out there who can argue with the fact that family is important, no matter who you are. Our families are the building block of society, and that is just the truth. And so the stronger our families can be, the more we can, have a positive impact on this world. So again, thank you, Mark. I appreciate it so much. You go have a great day. I don't know if you voted yet, but I'm heading out here to the polls in a few minutes. So thank you again for your time. Much appreciated, and God bless.
Thank you. You too.
Is patriotism dead? According to Mark Jorritsma, what he refers to as healthy patriotism is alive, but it's currently taking a bit of a backseat to unhealthy patriotism. Built on hope and a vision, he said, healthy patriotism provides a destination in which we are free to exercise our faith and citizenship together. Rather than focusing on my needs and wants, it focuses on us. Our society's tendency towards individualism can compromise this objective. So we need to work on taming back that individualism that sometimes can be a plus, thereby bringing things into a right perspective. Ultimately, Jorritsma rightly proposed that the core of a healthy government comes from healthy communities, and healthy communities flow from healthy families. Looking around, I see signs that we're further from that than ever. But as Christians, we never lose hope, and we know that God is ultimately in charge of it all. I like what Mother Teresa once said. She had a way of breaking down complexities, including this assertion: if you want to change the world, go home and love your family. While this almost seems too simple, it's not at all. Loving our families takes commitment, intention, time, and yes, sacrifice, and much of it. But if we do right by our families and trust also in the grace and mercy of God, there's a good chance that our life-giving love will spill out into the world, fostering many threads of hope. Well, we'll return in a couple of weeks to ask Janessa Filippi, Minnesota Mother of the Year and founder of the Down Home Ministry that provides furnishings and decor for those seeking a safe place to call home. Did Jesus really need a place to rest his head? Until then, don't lose sight of the light.